The first time anyone noticed her, the wind stopped. It didn't slow or fade, it simply died, as if something had silenced the world itself. And in that sudden stillness, the girl stood alone at the edge of town. No one saw her arrive, and no car had passed that road for hours. Yet there she was, barefoot on the gravel, her pale dress unmoving despite the lingering tension in the air. Her eyes stared forward, unblinking, as if she had been waiting. A farmer named Iqbal was the first to approach her. He called out twice, his voice uneasy but polite, asking if she was lost or needed help. The girl did not respond, not even a flicker of acknowledgement crossing her face. Iqbal stepped closer, his boots crunching loudly in the unnatural silence. He noticed then that her lips were slightly parted, but no breath seemed to pass between them. It was as if she existed without the need for air. Word spread quickly through the town by evening. People whispered about the silent girl, some claiming she was abandoned, others insisting she had wandered out of the nearby woods. A few swore they had seen her before, though none could say when. The local shopkeeper offered her food, placing bread and water in front of her. She accepted it without hesitation, eating slowly but without expression or gratitude. Not once did she make a sound, not even the smallest bite breaking the silence. Children gathered at a distance, watching her with wide, curious eyes. One brave boy tried to make her laugh by telling jokes, but her face remained cold and distant. When he touched her arm, he flinched as if he had brushed against something colder than ice. That night, the girl was given a small room in an old house near the town center. The family who took her in locked their doors early, though they couldn't explain why they felt the need to. Something about her presence pressed heavily against their thoughts. Hours passed, and the town settled into uneasy sleep. Dogs began to whine and scratch at doors, refusing to stay outside. A faint unease crept through the streets, like a whisper no one could quite hear. Inside the house, the girl sat on the edge of her bed, perfectly still. Her eyes remained open in the darkness, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. The air around her felt dense, as if the room itself was holding its breath. At exactly midnight, a glass shattered in the kitchen without warning. The family woke in terror, rushing to find the source, but nothing was disturbed except the broken shards on the floor. The girl, however, had not moved from her room. When they checked on her, she was standing by the window, staring into the blackness outside. For a moment, the mother thought she heard something, a faint whisper, almost like a voice trying to form. But the girl remained silent, and the darkness beyond the glass seemed to listen. The scream was heard before the body was found. It cut through the early morning air, sharp and desperate, pulling people from their homes in confusion and fear. By the time they reached the old well behind the mosque, the silence had already returned. A man lay twisted on the ground beside it, his face frozen in a terror so intense it barely looked human. His eyes were wide open, bloodshot, as if he had seen something no one else could. There were no wounds on his body, yet something about him felt horribly wrong. Villagers gathered in a loose circle, whispering nervously among themselves. Some refused to step closer, covering their mouths as if the air itself had become dangerous. Others stared, unable to look away from the unnatural stillness of the corpse. The imam arrived shortly after, pushing through the crowd with quiet urgency. He knelt beside the body, murmuring a prayer under his breath, but even his voice seemed to falter. When he touched the man's hand, he quickly pulled back, his expression tightening. "He's cold," someone said, though the sun had already begun to rise. Another man insisted it was normal, that death drained warmth quickly. But deep down, they all knew this cold felt different. A young boy stepped forward, trembling as he pointed toward the path leading to the well. He said he had seen someone standing there earlier, watching silently. When asked who, his voice dropped to a whisper. "The girl," he said, his eyes filling with fear. The crowd fell silent again, heavier this time, as if a shared thought had just taken shape. No one wanted to say her name, but everyone understood. Some tried to dismiss it as imagination, blaming the boy's fear for what he claimed to see. Others began recalling strange details, like how the man had passed by the girl the night before. A few even claimed he had looked uneasy, glancing back more than once. As the body was carried away, unease spread like a sickness through the town. Conversations became quieter, glances sharper, suspicion creeping into every interaction. And always, in the back of their minds, was the image of the silent girl. By midday, the story had twisted into something darker. People spoke of curses, of spirits that followed those who crossed their path. The girl, who had said nothing, now seemed to be at the center of it all. The family sheltering her began to feel the weight of the whispers. Neighbors avoided their house, and even friends hesitated to step inside. Fear had turned the girl into something unknown, something possibly dangerous. That evening, as shadows stretched across the town, the girl sat quietly as always. She neither reacted to the tension, nor acknowledged the growing distance around her. It was as if none of it concerned her, but when the father of the house glanced at her, he felt a chill crawl down his spine. For just a moment, he thought her eyes were fixed on him, not blank, but aware, and though she said nothing, it felt as if she already knew what was coming next. They came for her at dawn, just as the call to prayer faded into the pale sky. The knock on the door was not loud, but it carried a weight that made the entire house feel smaller. Everyone inside already knew who it was for. The father hesitated before opening the door, his hand trembling against the handle. 2 officers stood outside, their expressions firm but uneasy, as if they were forcing themselves to remain composed. Behind them, a small crowd had already gathered, watching in silence. "She needs to come with us," one of the officers said, his voice lower than usual. He avoided looking directly past the doorway, as if he didn't want to meet her gaze. The father tried to speak, but the words seemed to disappear before leaving his mouth. The girl stepped forward before anyone could stop her. Her bare feet made no sound against the floor, and her face remained as empty as ever. She walked past the officers without resistance, as though she had been expecting this moment. Outside, the crowd shifted uneasily as she appeared. Some stepped back, others whispered prayers under their breath, and a few simply stared in fear. No one dared to speak directly to her. As she was led through the streets, the town felt different. Windows closed quietly, doors locked, and even the birds seemed to vanish from the sky. It was as if the entire place was retreating from her presence. At the small courthouse, the air felt thick and suffocating. People filled every bench, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and dread. The girl was placed at the center, alone, surrounded by eyes that searched for something human within her. The judge entered with a stern expression, though a flicker of discomfort crossed his face when he saw her. He adjusted his robes, clearing his throat as he tried to regain control of the room. But the silence that followed felt heavier than anything he could command. The charges were read aloud, each word echoing unnaturally against the walls. Murder, suspicion, presence at the scene. None of it felt complete, yet it was enough to bind her to the trial. She stood still, showing no sign of understanding or fear. Witnesses were called, their voices shaky as they spoke of what they had seen. Each story circled back to her silence, to the way she watched without reacting. The more they spoke, the more the room seemed to tighten around her. Throughout it all, the girl said nothing. Not a breath, not a whisper, not even the smallest movement of her lips. Her stillness began to feel unnatural, like something held in place by an unseen force. As the judge prepared to continue, a faint flicker passed through the courtroom lights. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to make several people glance upward in unease. And in that brief moment of darkness, some swore they felt something shift, as if the trial had already begun in ways no one could understand. The first whisper came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It brushed against the edges of thought, too soft to hear yet impossible to ignore. Those who felt it stiffened in their seats, unsure if it had been real. A woman in the back clutched her chest, her breathing turning shallow. She looked around wildly, searching for the source of the voice that had called her name. No one else reacted, but her fear was unmistakable. Moments later, a man near the front flinched as if struck. He turned toward the girl, his face pale, lips trembling with something unspoken. When asked what was wrong, he shook his head, refusing to answer. The judge ordered silence, his voice sharper now, but it did little to steady the room. Papers on his desk shifted slightly, though no wind moved through the courtroom. A strange tension began to settle over everyone present. Another whisper came, louder this time, curling into the minds of those seated closest to her. It wasn't a sound in the air, but something that pressed directly into thought. Each person heard something different, something personal. A young clerk suddenly stood up, knocking over his chair. He muttered fragments of sentences, as if responding to someone no one else could see. His eyes darted toward the girl, filled with panic. The officers moved to restrain him, but he collapsed before they could reach him. His body shook violently, and his voice broke into sobs that echoed against the walls. No one could understand what he was saying. The girl remained still at the center of it all. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, lingering on each person as if studying them. Wherever her gaze settled, the whispers seemed to grow stronger. Lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the courtroom into brief darkness. When they returned, several people were covering their ears, others staring blankly ahead. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. A woman began to scream, insisting someone was speaking inside her head. She cried out names, dates, secrets she should never have revealed. The room filled with overlapping voices, confusion spiraling into fear. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but his authority had begun to crumble. Even he looked shaken now, his eyes betraying a growing dread. Whatever was happening, it was no longer under his control. Through it all, the girl said nothing. Yet her presence seemed to stretch across the room, touching every mind, every hidden corner of thought. And as the whispers deepened, it became clear that the silence she carried was far more terrifying than any scream. The moment came without warning, as if the air itself had decided it could no longer hold the silence. The whispers stopped all at once, leaving behind a crushing stillness that rang in everyone's ears. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward the girl. She slowly lifted her head, her gaze no longer distant or empty. For the first time, there was something behind her, eyes something aware, something ancient. A quiet dread settled over the room as people leaned back in fear. The judge opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His hand trembled above the gavel, frozen in place as if time itself had hesitated. No one moved, no one breathed. Then her lips parted. A single sound escaped, low and unnatural, vibrating through the room rather than traveling through the air. It did not belong to any language they knew, yet somehow it felt understood. It was not heard with ears, but with something deeper. A man in the front row gasped and clutched his head. He began whispering apologies to no one, tears streaming down his face. Others followed, each reacting to something unseen, something only they could perceive. The girl spoke again, longer this time. The sound twisted and layered over itself, as though multiple voices were speaking through her at once. Each tone carried a different weight, pressing into the minds of those listening. A woman screamed as she fell to her knees, confessing things she had hidden for years. Her voice shook as she revealed secrets she had never told another soul. Around her, more people began to break. The courtroom erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in panic and confession. Some begged for forgiveness, others denied what they were hearing, and a few simply wept. It was as if every buried truth had been dragged into the light. The judge stumbled back, his face drained of color. He muttered something under his breath, shaking his head as though trying to deny what he was feeling. But his eyes betrayed him. The girl's voice rose one final time, stronger, deeper, filling every corner of the room. The walls seemed to vibrate with it, the air thick with something unseen yet overwhelming. It felt less like speech and more like judgment. Then, as suddenly as it began, she fell silent again. The echoes of her voice lingered in the minds of everyone present. No one dared to speak, no one dared to move, as if any sound might bring it back. And in that fragile silence, they all knew something irreversible had just happened. For a long moment, no one moved after the silence returned. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on every person in the courtroom. It felt as though the air itself had thickened, trapping them inside that moment. Then someone began to laugh. It started softly, almost like a nervous reaction, but quickly twisted into something broken and uncontrollable. The man who laughed clutched his chest, his eyes wide with a terror that contradicted the sound escaping him. Others followed in different ways. Some cried openly, collapsing where they stood, while others whispered apologies into trembling hands. A few simply stared into nothing, their minds seemingly lost to whatever they had heard. The judge dropped his gavel, the sound echoing sharply through the room. He backed away from the bench, shaking his head as if trying to wake from a nightmare. His authority, once absolute, had completely dissolved. "End this," he finally said, though his voice barely carried. No one responded, because no one knew how to. The trial had lost all meaning. An officer stepped forward cautiously, his movements slow and uncertain. He reached for the girl's arm, hesitating just before making contact. The moment his fingers brushed her skin, he recoiled as if burned. "She's not right," he whispered, his voice breaking. His hand trembled as he stared at her, unable to explain what he felt. It wasn't pain, but something far worse. Suddenly, the doors of the courtroom slammed shut on their own. The sound thundered through the building, making several people scream. Panic surged again, raw and uncontrollable. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into alternating bursts of darkness and dim illumination. In those brief moments without light, shapes seemed to move where nothing should exist. Some swore they saw figures standing behind them. A man near the back shouted that someone was calling his name. He turned in circles, desperate to find the voice, but there was no one there. His panic spread, feeding the growing chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it all began, everything stopped. The lights steadied, the doors creaked open, and the noise faded into an unnatural calm. People looked around, disoriented, unsure if they were still in the same reality. At the center of the room, the girl was gone. No one had seen her leave, no door had opened, and no footsteps had been heard. She had simply vanished, leaving behind a silence far more terrifying than her presence. In the days that followed, the town tried to return to normal, but something had changed. People avoided eye contact, conversations felt hollow, and secrets no longer felt safe. It was as if the truth itself had been exposed and could never be hidden again. Some claimed they still heard her voice at night, whispering things they wished they could forget. Others refused to speak of the trial at all, as though silence could protect them. But deep down, everyone knew the same thing. The girl had spoken only once, and whatever she had said was still echoing, waiting, listening.